Let me tell you about Cadet Riley Murphy, the kind of human who looked at regulations and saw them as helpful suggestions rather than actual rules. At the Galactic Defense Academy, this made her either the most creative tactical mind in her class or the biggest headache for her instructors. Honestly, it was probably both. The Commander Vextar, her Zentorian instructor, had perfected the art of the disapproving head tentacle twitch whenever Riley was around. Zentorians were known for their rigid adherence to protocol, which made Vextar the perfect foil for Riley's more flexible approach to military procedure. His partner in suffering was Sergeant Clonk, a Bulgarian whose species had evolved pessimism into an art form. If something could go wrong, Clonk had already imagined 17 different ways it would happen, usually involving explosions. The morning of what would later be known as the Murphy incident started like any other training day. Riley was supposed to participate in a routine boarding exercise on derelict station Omega-7, a defunct mining platform that the Academy used for realistic combat scenarios. The mission brief was simple: infiltrate, secure, extract, basic stuff that even the most rule-following cadet could handle. Of course, Riley had never been accused of being rule-following. The first sign that things weren't going according to plan came when the Academy transport ship started taking actual weapons fire instead of simulated training beams. Real plasma bolts have a distinctive sound when they hit your hull, sort of like thunder mixed with the universe's way of telling you to pay attention. Commander Vextar's tentacles went completely rigid as emergency klaxons began wailing throughout the ship. "This is not part of the training exercise," he announced with the kind of calm that suggested he was one surprise away from having a complete nervous breakdown. Sergeant Clonk, meanwhile, had immediately assumed the worst. "We're all going to die," he declared cheerfully, probably painfully. "I knew I should have called in sick today." And through the chaos of emergency maneuvers and panicked communications, the truth became clear: the Crimson Talon mercenaries had taken over derelict station Omega-7. These weren't training holograms or practice targets. These were actual hostile forces with actual hostile weapons and what appeared to be an actual hostile attitude toward anyone wearing Academy colors. The transport ship managed to deposit Riley and her training gear onto the station before limping away to call for backup. As she watched the ship disappear into hyperspace, Riley's communication device crackled to life with Commander Vextar's voice. "Cadet Murphy, you are to surrender immediately and await extraction. That is a direct order. Do not engage the enemy. I repeat, do not engage the enemy." Riley looked at her comm device, looked at the enemy patrol walking past her hiding spot, then looked back at the comm device. She carefully adjusted a few settings and smiled. "Sorry, Commander," she said to herself. "I think you're breaking up." "You'd." The beautiful thing about communication equipment, Riley had learned during her electronics training, is that it's surprisingly fragile. A few crossed wires here, a loose connection there, and suddenly you can't hear your commanding officer telling you to do sensible things like surrender or retreat or not blow anything up. Of course, Riley's comm device worked perfectly fine. She just happened to be very good at creative interpretation. Her first priority was reconnaissance, which is military speak for figuring out exactly how much trouble you've gotten yourself into. The station's layout was familiar from previous training exercises, but now it was crawling with Crimson Talon mercenaries who looked like they'd stepped out of a scary space pirate's monthly catalogue. They were well armed, well organized, and apparently well informed about Academy protocols. That last part should have been her first clue that something was seriously wrong. While crawling through a maintenance shaft, Riley discovered she wasn't completely alone on the station. The facility's central computer system was still active, and it had what could generously be called a personality. "Attention, unidentified human," came a voice that sounded like it had been programmed by someone with a severe case of attitude. "I am Boris, the Basic Operations and Reasoning Intelligence System. I should probably mention that you're trespassing on a station currently occupied by heavily armed criminals who would very much like to shoot you." Riley paused in her crawling. "Thanks for the update, Boris. I'm Cadet Murphy, and I'm here to help." "Help?" Boris sounded skeptical. "No offense, human, but there's one of you and approximately 47 of them." The mathematics don't exactly work in your favor. You'd be surprised, Riley said, examining the maintenance panel in front of her. These mercenaries might know Academy protocols, but I bet they don't know maintenance protocols. What exactly are you suggesting? Riley grinned in the darkness of the maintenance shaft. Ever wonder what happens when you reverse the polarity on a gravitational stabilizer? That would cause localized gravitational anomalies that could severely disrupt normal movement and orientation, Boris replied. It would also violate approximately 17 safety regulations. Perfect, Riley said, already reaching for the appropriate controls. Let's start with the East Corridor. Her first act of sabotage was beautifully simple. The Crimson Talon patrol in the East Corridor suddenly found themselves walking on what used to be the ceiling, while their equipment fell upward toward what used to be the floor. The confusion lasted exactly long enough for Riley to reprogram their weapons to refuse authorization from anyone with a criminal record. I have to admit, Boris said as they watched the mercenaries struggle with their suddenly non-functional weapons. This is considerably more entertaining than running routine diagnostics. Riley was already moving to her next target. Boris, what can you tell me about the station's environmental controls? Well, I can adjust temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, and lighting in any section of the station. Why do you ask? Because, Riley said, accessing another maintenance panel. Nothing ruins a mercenary's day quite like suddenly finding yourself in a room where it's snowing. The Crimson Talons in the central hub were having a perfectly normal discussion about their mission parameters when the temperature dropped 30 degrees and artificial snow began falling from the atmospheric recyclers. And in the confusion that followed, Riley managed to disable their communications array and reprogram their door locks to respond only to knock-knock jokes. This is highly irregular, Boris observed, though he was beginning to sound almost amused. Also highly effective. Riley was warming up to her new AI partner. Boris, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. By the time Captain Snarl realized his men were dealing with something more complicated than a routine Academy mop-up operation, Riley had turned 3/4 of derelict Station Omega-7 into her own personal funhouse of mayhem. The mercenary leader was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd chosen Snarl as his professional name, tall, scarred, and possessed of the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he'd never found anything amusing in his entire life. He was about to find out what it felt like to be the punchline. Status report. Snarl growled into his communicator, which had been producing nothing but static and what sounded like elevator music for the past hour. Sir, we've lost contact with Teams 3, 7, and 12, came the nervous reply from one of his subordinates. Team 9 is reporting that their section is experiencing localized weather patterns, and Team 6 says their weapons keep asking them to please insert valid identification. Captain Snarl had been in the mercenary business long enough to recognize when something had gone seriously wrong with what should have been a simple job. Find whoever's doing this and terminate them. Riley, meanwhile, was having the time of her life. She'd discovered that the station's food dispensers could be reprogrammed to shoot nutritional paste with surprising accuracy, and the waste management system could create some truly impressive distractions when properly motivated. Boris had proven to be an enthusiastic accomplice, particularly after Riley had taught him how to play practical jokes with the station's holographic training systems. I'm detecting 15 hostiles approaching your position, Boris announced as Riley finished rewiring another control panel. They appear to be carrying actual military-grade equipment this time. Time for Plan B, Riley said, heading for the nearest garbage chute. What's Plan B? I'll let you know when I figure it out. Nay? Well. The garbage disposal system of a space station is not designed for human occupancy, but it does offer certain advantages for someone trying to avoid heavily armed mercenaries. For one thing, it connects to virtually every section of the station. For another, nobody expects their target to come crawling out of a trash compactor covered in food waste and looking like they're having the best day of their life. It was while she was navigating the less glamorous parts of the station's infrastructure that Riley made her most important discovery. Hidden behind what appeared to be a routine maintenance access point, she found a secondary computer core that the mercenaries had been very busy with. "Boris," she whispered, "are you seeing this?" "I am now accessing the secondary systems," Boris replied, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Riley, these mercenaries aren't just occupying the station. They're downloading the Academy's entire tactical database." Riley felt her stomach drop. The Academy's tactical database contained defense patterns, fleet movements, and communication protocols for the entire sector. In the wrong hands, that information could compromise every friendly operation within 50 light years. "Well," she said, looking at the data transfer in progress, "that changes things." "The download is approximately 60% complete," Boris informed her. "At current rates, they'll have everything within 2 hours." Riley studied the setup, her mind racing through possibilities. The mercenaries had established a hardwired connection to prevent interference, and they'd posted guards at every conventional access point. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the creative potential of the station's own systems. "Boris, can you access the quantum communication array from here?" "Yes, but that system is designed for interstellar communications, not local network operations. Using it for anything else would be highly irregular and potentially dangerous." Riley grinned. "Perfect. How do you feel about turning this whole station into the galaxy's most expensive practical joke?" "I'm beginning to suspect," Boris replied, "that your definition of help is significantly different from standard protocol." "You have no idea," Riley said, already reaching for the quantum array controls. "But you're about to find out. The thing about quantum communication arrays is that they're designed to send information across vast distances instantaneously. What they're not designed for is being jury-rigged into a station-wide holographic projection system by a cadet with more enthusiasm than sense. But then again, most equipment isn't designed for the kind of creative interpretation that Riley specialized in. "Are you certain this will work?" Boris asked as Riley finished connecting the quantum array to the station's training hologram generators. "Define work," Riley replied, making some final adjustments. "If you mean accomplish our objective without creating any unforeseen complications, then probably not. If you mean create enough chaos to stop the data theft and possibly traumatize some mercenaries, then absolutely." Boris processed this for a moment. "I'm not entirely certain those are acceptable parameters for success." "Trust me," Riley said, powering up the modified system. "I've got this." What happened next could best be described as every training simulation Riley had ever participated in deciding to manifest simultaneously throughout the station. The corridors filled with holographic academy instructors barking contradictory orders, phantom training exercises materialized in empty rooms, and the entire East Wing became convinced it was under attack by a fleet of ships that existed only in the computer's memory banks. The effect on the Crimson Talon mercenaries was immediate and spectacular. Suddenly confronted with what appeared to be dozens of Academy personnel conducting impossible training scenarios in every direction, they began responding to threats that weren't actually there while ignoring the very real sabotage happening all around them. Contact. Multiple hostiles in Corridor 7. Came a panicked voice over the mercenary communications channel that Riley had been monitoring. "Negative, Corridor 7 is clear," replied another voice. "I'm showing massive enemy presence in the hangar bay." "The hangar bay is empty, you idiots." Captain Snarl's voice cut through the confusion. "Someone is playing games with our sensors." Riley smiled as she watched the mercenaries' tactical coordination fall apart. "Boris, how's our data transfer situation?" "The download has been interrupted. It appears the mercenaries are having difficulty maintaining their connection while also responding to 17 simultaneous combat situations that may or may not exist." "Excellent. Phase 2. Riley had been saving the station's zero-gravity combat simulator for just the right moment, and that moment had arrived. The simulator occupied the central hub of the station and could create localized gravitational fields anywhere within its operational area. Under normal circumstances, it was used to train cadets in three-dimensional combat tactics. Under Riley's direction, it became something considerably more interesting. She activated the simulator just as a squad of mercenaries entered the central hub, chasing one of her holographic distractions. Suddenly, they found themselves floating in zero gravity, while weapons fire from Academy training scenarios created light shows all around them. The confusion was beautiful to watch. "This is highly irregular," Boris observed, "also highly effective." Riley was already moving to her next objective. Using the station's maintenance tunnels, she'd managed to reach the mercenaries' command center, where Captain Snarl was trying to regain control of the situation. Through a combination of stealth, timing, and the fact that everyone was too busy dealing with imaginary threats to notice her, Riley managed to get close enough to their detention facility to implement the next phase of her plan. The Academy's detention protocols were designed to safely contain prisoners during transport operations. They were not designed to be activated remotely by someone who had just convinced the station's computer that 47 armed mercenaries were actually Academy personnel who had failed to check in for mandatory psychological evaluation. "Attention Crimson Talon personnel," Boris announced over the station's general communication system, his voice now carrying the authority of an official Academy announcement. "You are required to report to designated detention areas for mandatory compliance review. Failure to comply will result in additional charges of insubordination." The beautiful thing about mercenaries is that most of them have spent enough time in military organizations to respond instinctively to official-sounding orders, especially when those orders come through what appears to be legitimate command channels. By the time they realized what was happening, Riley had managed to secure nearly half of Captain Snarl's forces using nothing more than the station's own prisoner management systems. Captain Snarl, however, was not fooled. Enough. His voice boomed through the communication system. "I don't know who you are, but this ends now. I'm going to complete this mission personally, and then I'm going to find you and make you regret every single trick you've pulled." Riley looked at the tactical display showing Snarl's position heading directly for the quantum communication array. "Well, Boris," she said, "looks like it's time for the finale. Should I be concerned about your definition of finale?" Riley grinned as she headed for the main hangar. "Only if you're not a fan of dramatic conclusions." Captain Snarl had reached that special level of anger where rational thought gives way to the kind of focused fury that makes bad people do spectacularly stupid things. He'd lost most of his crew to a single Academy cadet who appeared to have turned the entire station into her personal playground, and his multi-million credit data theft operation was falling apart around his ears. Riley, meanwhile, was putting the finishing touches on what she privately called Operation. How did this seem like a good idea? "Boris," she said, accessing the main hangar's cargo loading system, "I need you to convince the remaining mercenaries that they're about to be boarded by a full Academy battle fleet." "That would require me to fabricate sensor readings, communication intercepts, and tactical data that would be completely false," Boris replied. "Yes, Ian. And you want me to make it convincing enough that trained mercenaries will believe they're facing imminent assault by superior forces?" Exactly. Exactly. This plan has approximately 17 different ways it could go catastrophically wrong. Riley paused in her preparation of what could generously be called improvised tactical equipment. "You've been talking to Sergeant Clonk, haven't you?" "I have been analyzing probability matrices," Boris replied. "But yes, his pessimistic projections are beginning to seem remarkably prescient." "Trust me," Riley said, activating the hangar's atmospheric force fields. "What's the worst that could happen?" What happened next was that every sensor on derelict station Omega-7 suddenly registered the approach of 12 Academy warships, complete with tactical deployment patterns and communication traffic that suggested an imminent full-scale assault. The Phantom Fleet appeared on every screen, every scanner, and every tactical display the mercenaries had access to. The effect was immediate. Captain Snarl's remaining forces, already rattled by hours of inexplicable phenomena and tactical impossibilities, began preparing for a siege that existed only in the station's computer systems. In the confusion, Riley managed to position herself in the main hangar, where the quantum communication array had its primary access point. Captain Snarl arrived at the hangar with 3 of his remaining subordinates, all of them looking like they'd spent the day fighting ghosts, which, in a sense, they had. "Sir," one of them reported, "we're reading massive fleet presence on all sensors. 12 ships, full battle configuration. I don't care if it's the entire Academy Armada," Snarl growled, heading for the communication array. "We're finishing this job." That was when Riley decided to make her dramatic entrance. The cargo loading system of a space station is designed to move massive containers with precision and speed. It is not designed to launch Academy cadets at unsuspecting mercenaries, while dramatic holographic explosions provide background ambience. But Riley had never been one to let technical specifications limit her creativity. She came flying out of the loading tube at approximately 30 miles per hour, surrounded by a cloud of holographic weapon fire, and shouting what could only be described as a very enthusiastic battle cry. The effect on the mercenaries was everything she'd hoped for and slightly more than she'd planned on. Captain Snarl spun around just in time to see what appeared to be an Academy cadet launching herself at him like a very small, very determined missile. His attempt to bring his weapon to bear was interrupted by Riley's collision with his center of mass, which sent both of them tumbling across the hangar floor. What followed was the kind of hand-to-hand combat that Academy instructors spend years trying to teach and cadets spend years trying to avoid. Riley had the advantage of surprise and momentum, but Snarl had the advantage of being twice her size and considerably more experienced with violence as a career choice. The fight might have gone very differently if Boris hadn't chosen that moment to activate every single holographic training program simultaneously, filling the hangar with phantom combat scenarios, imaginary explosions, and what appeared to be a recreation of the Battle of Vega Prime complete with sound effects. In the chaos, Riley managed to use the cargo loading system's remote controls to drop a shipping container on two of Snarl's subordinates, while the third became convinced he was under attack by holographic Academy Marines who were shouting very realistic death threats. Captain Snarl, meanwhile, found himself wrestling with a human who seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of dirty tricks and an alarming enthusiasm for improvised weapons. When Riley grabbed a cargo crane's control cable and used it to swing around the hangar like some kind of demented space pirate, Snarl realized that this particular job had gone well beyond his usual parameters. The final blow came when Riley managed to activate the hangar's artificial gravity at precisely the moment Snarl was leaping toward her. Instead of tackling her, he found himself slamming into the floor with enough force to rattle his teeth and significantly reduce his enthusiasm for continued combat. "Boris," Riley said, standing over the unconscious mercenary leader, "please inform the remaining hostiles that they have 5 minutes to surrender before I start getting creative with the life support systems." "Should I mention that you're bluffing about the life support systems?" Riley grinned. "Who says I'm bluffing?" It was at that precise moment that the real Academy fleet arrived, their ships decloaking just outside the station's defensive perimeter. Commander Vextar's voice came through the communication system with the kind of calm that suggested he was one surprise away from a complete nervous breakdown. "Cadet Murphy," he said, "please report your status." Riley looked around the hangar, which was currently occupied by unconscious mercenaries, holographic combat scenarios, and what appeared to be the aftermath of a very enthusiastic demolition project. "Mission accomplished, sir," she replied. "The station is secure." The debriefing room aboard the Academy command ship was designed to be intimidating, with its stark walls, harsh lighting, and seating arrangement that made anyone under questioning feel like they were on trial. Riley sat in the center chair, looking remarkably relaxed for someone who had just spent the day turning a routine training exercise into what the official reports would eventually describe as an unprecedented tactical situation. Commander Vextar paced back and forth, his head tentacles twitching with what might have been stress, confusion, or possibly admiration. It was hard to tell with Zentorians. Sergeant Clonk occupied a corner of the room, muttering occasionally about how he'd known something like this would happen and why nobody ever listened to his disaster predictions. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Commander Vextar said, consulting his datapad. "You were given direct orders to surrender and await extraction." "Yes, sir," Riley replied cheerfully. "And instead you single-handedly defeated 47 armed mercenaries, prevented the theft of classified tactical data, and captured their entire operation intact." "Well, technically Boris helped with the tactical coordination," Riley said. "I couldn't have done it without his support." Boris, who had been connected to the debriefing room's communication system, added his own commentary. I feel I should mention that Cadet Murphy's definition of help involved several violations of standard safety protocols and at least 14 uses of station equipment in ways that directly contradict manufacturer specifications. Commander Vextar's tentacles twitched more violently. Cadet Murphy, you were specifically ordered not to engage the enemy. Actually, sir, Riley said, pulling out her communication device, I believe your exact words were that I should surrender and await extraction, which I interpreted as tactical guidance rather than absolute directives, especially considering the communication difficulties I was experiencing. She demonstrated the device's perfectly functional communication capabilities by connecting instantly to the ship's main communication array. Sergeant Clonk looked up from his corner. I knew she was going to say something like that, he announced gloomily. Humans never follow orders the way they're supposed to. It always ends in explosions or paperwork. Usually both. But in my defense. Riley continued. The mercenaries were in the process of stealing classified Academy data. Allowing them to complete that operation would have compromised security for the entire sector. I felt that preventing that outcome took priority over strictly following communication protocols. Commander Vextar stopped pacing and looked directly at Riley. Cadet Murphy. What you did today was simultaneously the most effective tactical operation I've witnessed in 20 years of service, and the most flagrant disregard for military protocol I've ever encountered. Thank you, sir, Riley replied uncertainly. That wasn't a compliment, Vextar said. That was an observation that's going to make writing your evaluation extremely complicated. Boris interjected again. If I may add to the official record, Cadet Murphy's tactical innovations were highly irregular but remarkably effective. Her ability to improvise solutions using available resources was quite impressive, even if her methods were unconventional. Unconventional, Sergeant Clonk repeated. That's one way to describe turning a space station into a haunted house. Riley grinned. I prefer to think of it as adaptive tactical thinking. Commander Vextar set down his data pad and looked at Riley with the expression of someone who had just realized that his quiet career in military education was about to become significantly more interesting. Cadet Murphy, he said finally, you are hereby commended for exceptional valor in the face of enemy action, innovative tactical thinking, and single-handedly preventing a significant security breach. Riley's grin widened. You are also assigned to extra kitchen duty for the next month for willful disobedience, unauthorized use of Academy equipment, and giving your commanding officers what I can only assume will be permanent stress-related health issues. Yes, sir, Riley replied, not looking particularly concerned about the kitchen duty. As they prepared to leave the debriefing room, Commander Vextar paused at the door. Cadet Murphy, in the future, when you receive direct orders from a superior officer, those orders are not suggestions or guidelines or tactical recommendations. They are orders. Do you understand me? Riley stood and saluted with textbook precision. Absolutely, sir. I understand completely. Vextar's tentacles twitched one final time as he left the room, followed by Sergeant Clonk, who was already muttering about how the next training exercise would probably involve Riley accidentally starting an interstellar war. Boris's voice followed Riley as she headed for the door. Cadet Murphy, might I ask what you meant when you told Commander Vextar that you understood his orders completely? Riley paused and smiled. Oh, that's simple, Boris. I understand that he wants me to follow orders. I just haven't promised to do it the way he expects me to. I have a feeling, Boris replied, that your next training exercise is going to be very interesting. Boris, Riley said, I think you're starting to understand humans. And somewhere in the Academy's personnel files, a new note was added to Cadet Riley Murphy's record, exceptional tactical ability, recommend advanced training. Also recommend sedatives for supervising officers.